Jon, welcome to Ultrahabits. People don't know this is our round two. We had some technical issues, so hopefully we're twice better in this conversation, man. Welcome to the show again.
Hey, good to be back.
Yeah, so look, I have been kind of aware of you and spoke to you off and on over the years on LinkedIn and in various channels. And one of the things that became clear within the kind of Ultrahabits community was people started to talk about, well, how do we develop habits around getting more comfortable speaking, whether it's presenting at work or public speaking. And I couldn't think of anyone better than you to actually have on the show to talk about this subject. And I think the reason why it's so powerful having you on the show. Not only do you coach and help people get better at this, but you yourself, like, you're not a super extroverted person. You don't come across as someone that's like likes to have a rah-rah and, like gets to, get on stage and just kind of hammer it out. So I think like you're super accessible in that way. So I guess before we go into how people can get more comfortable in different forums of speaking, how did you actually fall into this?
Yeah, it's a funny one for me. As you've already mentioned, I'm a shy introvert. So if you do any of those psychographic profiles, I'm not only introvert, I'm off the scale introvert. But I had this necessity when I graduated from university. I did IT in the mid-90s. And the thing that was clear and present to me was the millennium bug, Y2K. There was the date for moving that date, time was not negotiable. And so the urgency just kind of crept up and up and up and up. But people weren't taking it seriously. And there was no CIOs or CTOs back then. And, a CEO wouldn't give you a meeting time, to a newly minted graduate out of uni. But I had one advantage. And all that was he had to walk past my desk on the way to his office. And so I got really good at these short sound bites at a level he could understand.
Why don't you just dive back into kind of the shy extrovert piece?
Sure. As you mentioned earlier, I do have those shy tendencies. I am naturally a shy and introverted person. And if you do any of those psychographic profiles and you measure me, I'm not only an introvert, I'm off the scale introvert. But I had this unique challenge back in the 90s as a newly minted IT graduate, in that I was trying to convince the CEO, because there was no such thing as a CIO or a CTO, that, Y2K was a thing. He wouldn't give me the time of day, much less a meeting. But I was lucky in that he had to walk past my desk on the way to his office. And so I got really good at these short sound bites at a level he could understand, with a degree of impact that made him pay attention. And that became really the impetus of my awareness that the ability to say the right thing at the right time to the right person in the right way was actually a skill set. And I developed this to the point where I was living in London, working with mission critical systems, traders, trading banks, 5,000 of them to be exact. And I had to convince each of them to take their computer away for between half an hour and half a day. Now, the challenge I had there was that for every 15 minutes their computer was down, they were personally losing £1 million sterling revenue. So it became a rather good, baptism of fire in terms of negotiation and communication skills. Wind forward a little bit, and in 2009, when I joined TEDx Melbourne, one of the things I got access to was the TED data. And that TED data was rather interesting to me as an IT guy, because there was data in there about when someone would pause, rewind, or abandon a video. And I used statistical modeling to help me develop my skills further and to give advice to other people when on the TED stage. And then that basically expanded out into industry, where I did a little bit more industry data and research, to today, where that's pretty much what I do full time for any organization that's interested in working with me.
Well, you're an excellent communicator, Jon. I mean, were you painfully shy?
Yeah, no.
Like, were you one of those people that, it was very difficult
I
to
didn't even like
open
speaking in
your
small groups amongst my friends much, And even today, I'm not really known for speaking a whole lot. So no, speaking extroversion is definitely not an attribute. If I had to pick the perfect holiday, it's a quiet place in the sun with almost no one there. That would be like my perfect holiday. I really need to recharge in those really quiet spaces.
I think it makes it even more impactful, though, because for you, what it proves to everyone and to all of us is that it's actually a skill.
Really.
Right?
Really.
It is a skill. And I think that there's this view of natural oration, and whilst that may be true, there are also different elements of communication. I mean, that point you made around your kind of elevated pitch almost to the CEO and having that kind of bite-sized, impactful, quick dialogue with your CEO, like how great is that in terms of if individuals could learn to implement that, particularly within their careers, right? Because most executives are time poor. And so like being able to articulate a message quickly with impact and then kind of stepping back, like that's a skill,
absolutely.
right?
100% convinced it's a learned skill. And a little bit like a muscle or a mental muscle, you can develop this over time. It doesn't have to be something you do all at once and then forget. But it is a muscle in that it will degrade to a degree. So you still got to, if you want to be sharp, you've got to keep going. But once you learn the skill, it's always there.
And let's talk about different forms of communication, right? So there's like oration, there's giving a speech, and there's things like TED Talk, which is a talk, and then there's presenting or pitching, let's say at a board level, or you're trying to pitch an idea. There's things like selling, there's kind of hand-to-hand communication, kind of negotiating and trying to influence like you did with the stock traders. Like how do all these things vary in terms of skills required, and what are the different contexts when you look at just communication in general?
When we're talking about speaking, communication and influence, there are things you say and then there's things you need to be aware of. And the things you need to be aware of externally are things like who they are, what they think of you, what their knowledge, experience and background, how they perceive you. And that's obvious, I guess. But then there are other environmental considerations, like what are they expecting for you? The difference between a speech, a lecture, a lesson and an oration are quite different. And so the way you prepare for that and the way you layer the information and the complexity and the detail you would go into would also vary. It's not unlike thinking about, if I said to you, you're going to do a talk this afternoon for half an hour, the amount of time you'd prepare and the amount of pressure you'd give yourself would be different if the audience was the local kindergarten versus the chair of the board. So it's about being mindful about all the contextual situations you need to adapt for, sometimes in real time, in order to make sure that your message lands. And so there's a big argument in my world for being really prepared and being clear in your head, because if it's clear in your head, it can be clear in your audience's head. If it's not clear in your head, the audience hasn't got a chance. And so being clear in your head then means you spend less time thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And you can spend more time working on how's the audience responding and how they're expecting to receive the message and shape your narrative accordingly. And so it's really about being sensible about your communication just as much as being precise or, systemic about it, although that helps.
You and I talked about the power of preparation, and I think, like I'm a big preparer. Like I'm okay in front of people and presenting and with oration. It's good and it's okay for me, but I do prepare. And a lot of people don't realize the level of preparation. I think you and I talked about when I was doing my MBA, I would do the final pitches to, big consulting firms that would come in, and they would be 10 to 15 minute pitches. And the night before, everyone's having beers and drinks, and I'm in the room till 2 a.m. just prepping. And that allowed me to be spontaneous. However, you do at times see people that prepare, and you see them on TED or TEDx, and it comes across as robotic, right? So like there's a real, and how does one ensure that through preparation, it doesn't seem that they've memorized? You know what I mean? Versus kind of, because you want to prepare, but still be kind of fluid and spontaneous, right?
If you're prepared, well, there's a saying in the speaking world, amateurs practice till they get it right. Professionals practice it till they can't get it wrong. And so what we mean by that is you practice it to the point where, you can say it without even thinking about it. But what else would you need to do to naturalize it? What I call a lived experience. If I said to you, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You would never go, how would I language and structure myself in such a way that John would understand what I put in my mouth? Because you lived that experience. And I would argue that we need to get our content to a point where it's a lived experience. It naturally comes out, so that if something comes in that we don't expect, it just becomes just a minor distraction in the conversation. And that's where the improvisation can really be natural. But if you practice it, and you're thinking, is my slide right? Why didn't they laugh at my joke? Why are they paying attention? You're in your head. And if you're in your head, you can't be with your audience. And that's where the disconnects happen. So what's happening is when you see someone who's robotic on stage, they're in their head. They haven't practiced it enough, so it's so natural that it just almost oozes out of them without even thinking about it. And so I guess there's a window where you practice to a point, and then you've got to go over that. And so my rule of thumb there is practice until you're thoroughly sick of it. Calculate how much time that took, and add another 50%. And that would be where you'd sort of take the edges off, or de-roboticize, if that's a word, that robotic nature. Yeah. In the professional world, in the acting world, they call that adding the warts. So they practice to the point where they memorize the lines, they know it so well, but then they deliberately add faults in, they deliberately add quirks in, they deliberately add personality traits in, so that the performer then becomes the character, as opposed to the actor becoming the performer. And so that becomes just the subtle differences that makes those really great actors look like they are literally that character.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think, when we prepare, and I guess that leads to my next question, like how much risk should a speaker take in regards to reading their audience and maybe implementing that kind of, those kind of nuances on the spot, right? Like in terms of how comfortable they are, but like, how would you answer that question? Like, say you're giving a speech and you kind of are reading the audience, which I think you would agree you should do, but how much courage should you have to kind of delineate from what you've prepared?
So preparation strong preparation is the foundation of all good work. And I don't care whether that's speaking, building a house, executing a project. So, the better you're prepared, the better you're going to execute. Simple. In terms of variables there's your knowledge and experience and background of the content, the quality of relationship you have with the person you're at, the nature of the situation you're in. Is this a regular meeting, a formal meeting, an emergency meeting, a conference, just a friendly chat? Like those will determine your nervousness levels. And then matching their needs and expectations with your knowledge and experience. So depending on how many factors are critical, you will need to prepare more or less according to that. Now, having said that, especially in business, sometimes you don't get time to prepare. And sometimes you maybe get less than 5 minutes. And that's one of the reasons I created the models that I did. They allow you to create a narrative or a compelling conversation in 5 minutes or less by just knowing what things to prepare for.
And what are some of those things within the model?
There are five key areas in my world. So there's environment, why you're here, what's about, what is the situation that causes this to come together. If it's a regular meeting or emergency meeting is a good example of that. But also time of day. It's easier to have a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday than 4:55 as they're running out the door on a Friday. And then, certain other contextual elements like, is this the first time you're meeting them? It's the, et cetera. So that's environment. All the things largely that you need to be mindful of before you even open your mouth. Next level down, if we want to sort of stack rank this, there's 5 things here, but the next level down I call organization. And that's where organizational rapport comes in. If I say Apple, Nike, or Tesla, there's a different visceral response than to say Toyota, Dell, and Adidas. And if this is an internal conversation, then it's the reputation of the team. So I was in the IT team for a lot of the time, and I was acutely aware that when we were speaking to HR or any of the other parts of the organization, that we didn't have the best reputation for being clear thinking, easy to understand, on time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So organizational nature then determines pre-event perception. Next level down is your ability to build trust, rapport, credibility, your rank, your role, your title, your degree of competence, as you already mentioned, those sorts of things. Being prepared personally is a really important factor. And those three areas color someone's perception of you before you even open your mouth. And so you've got to have those up prepared. The fourth thing is the message, and that's basically saying the right thing at the right time to the right person the right way. And that includes complexity. That includes detail. That includes time, in terms of length. All those then become critical factors. And then the fifth element is audience, which is, who are they? Are they paying attention? What are their priorities? What are their projects? How do they make decisions? Who influences them in making the decisions? There's a whole bunch of other factors, and this is where probably 80% of my preparation time goes, to understand every fact and nuance for every stakeholder in the room, so that you could address their needs before they even need to open their mouth. And that way they're with you the whole time, as opposed to in their head going off on some tangent, but you didn't mention this, but you've forgotten that, but you assumed that. You don't want that sort of stuff going on in their head. Because if that's going on, then they're not listening to you 100%, and you need them to pay attention. Because if they're paying attention, you can connect. If you're not connecting, then obviously you failed as a communicator.
Now you're coming into my world and the world of selling. And Jon, I don't know if you've ever thought about consulting to sales teams, because effectively what you're talking about is the strategic selling environment, understanding your environment and really doing your homework on the stakeholders, the nuances, the circuses, I call it, before you even go in the room is critical. And, oration is, the speech piece. I think that may require some level of awareness of your audience, but the world we're now moving into in terms of what we're talking about requires a high level of EQ and sensitivity and research into your environment. And I don't think that many people realize that when you do that, it actually impacts your communication for the better. Like the communication piece is the last piece of all this preparation and all the work that you're doing to really understand the ecosystem and the environment.
And
right?
Look, equally for sales as any other conversations, the more you can sort of be prepared in terms of what you want to say and how you want to say it, the more time you can spend being with that person and humanly connecting.
Yeah.
And so sales is a certain type of engagement, in the same way that an oration is a certain type of engagement, in the same way that catching up with your mates is a certain type of engagement. It's just the stakes are different. And so you need to make sure that you're preparing appropriately for the level of engagement that you need to have.
Do you think that communication is valued in different cultures more or less? And the reason I ask this question is America's heavily indexed to worshiping good orators, and sometimes good and to the detriment, I think, of that society. If someone could speak well, people will follow. Within Australia, we don't seem to be that concerned with great communication. In fact, I remember, again, when I was doing my MBA and I had presented something to Ernst & Young in one of the projects. One of the girls in the cohort came up to me and she said, "You're a great speaker," but she goes like, "It's a bit of a performance, isn't it?" And it was like, I understood what she was saying, because in Australia, we should laugh at ourselves. So I kind of laughed. But in some ways, there was a bit of perception coming from her that I think speaks a lot about the society here in Australia, that like it was almost too much. And so could being too good of a communicator be detrimental?
Yeah.
Like, how does being a communicator vary from culture to culture, particularly, let's say, the US and places like...
So what she's referring to is the tone of your delivery. And I imagine, and this is very common in the US, it's high energy, it's very definitive, it's very unambiguous. It's like, this is how it is. And so the expectation of the US audience is met by that type of style. Then there's the quieter, more subdued side, which is a bit more colonial, a bit more Australian. And the professional speakers in Australia call our style and the Canadian style of delivery, which is, so there is actually a label for it in the professional speaking world in the US, and it's more subdued. It's a bit more self-deprecating. It's a lot more casual. It's a little bit less, we call it rah-rah, but I don't know if you have a word for it. Yeah. And so, it's matching and meeting not only expectations, but the energy levels in the room. Sometimes I do go rah-rah when I need to G them up just after lunch, or when they're a bit distracted, but I don't stay there. And I think what she's referring to is that your style, maybe you were staying there, but you weren't maybe coming back to the needs and expectations of the room or the energy of that room where that sort of aligned or meshed. And so this is where meeting the audience where they are and why audience is so important, because you need to adjust continually in real time to do that. And in fact, we tested this really very specifically with our Zoom calls, because a lot of people said Zoom fatigue. I had no evidence of Zoom fatigue during lockdown. TEDx Melbourne ran events. We had a net promoter score of about 48 for people who know what that is. Quick backstory, it's between minus 100 and positive 100. Most people are happy with about 0. A good performing organization is considered good at about 20. We're about 48. So, and then to go from 48 to 49 is exponentially harder. It's significantly harder. But within 3 months, measuring specific metrics, we're able to get our net promoter score to 98 by measuring things in Zoom that you can't in real life. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but we were able to really quantify the impact we were having at any given moment. And so I'm 100% convinced that the things that we measure in terms of our speaking performance are not only quantifiable, but are literally measurable in real time. And that's what we were doing. We were measuring the impact in real time, adjusting our delivery or format in real time, adjusting our content in real time, and making sure that the audience was engaged. And we did a bit of a test. Our 1-hour events, we said, we're going to hang around. And if you want to hang around after the event, we'll just stay and have a chat. 97% of the people stayed for at least 2 hours. And I think about 80% of them stayed for 3 hours. That is 2 hours past the formal close of the event because of the engagement we had with the room. And so Zoom fatigue is really basically being not boring, not the fact that Zoom in and of itself is a difficult medium. Now, I can't take away that Zoom is new to people and we're not really used to it and it's easy to get distractions and it's hard to stare at a screen for an hour. I get all that stuff. But knowing all that stuff, what do you do about it is the question. And I don't think people were asking themselves that question. We went very specific there and were able to shift our net promoter score very significantly because we knew what to look for.
Has that work allowed you to start to help people become better communicators on Zoom? Like, is this an area of kind of focus for you now?
We took all our live metrics, applied it to Zoom, and noticed they still work. But one of the things we did when we got into Zoom is there were other things that we didn't measure that we could add that you couldn't do in real life. For example, in a meeting, let's say there's 50 people, the probability of you being within 1 meter of their face, arm's length from the camera, all 50 people is 0. It's almost impossible to do, if not impossible. And it's weird because you don't want to get in someone's face. But there are 1,500 microfacial movements in the face that when in the combinations of permutations we call emotion. And we can see that in real time. Small curls of the mouth, slight curls in the eyebrows, micro tweaks, in the mouth that you can't see in a face-to-face situation. And where we're using that statistical cues to determine the impact we're having. And so these sorts of things you can measure really, really easily digitally that are really, really hard to do in a room. And so it gave us extra fidelity that proved even more to us that in life or on Zoom, we knew the things to measure in order to have the impact we needed to have.
What were some of the insights from that? Like, what made a really good talk? Like, were there key indicators? Was it polish? Was it content? Like, what are some of the things that you learned from that you kind of maybe already knew and it validated, or that shocked you?
So this is where the preparation needs to come into place. We rate each moment, literally every minute if we can, at an impact level between 0, which is ho-hum, to 10 out of 10 mind blown. And we need to know that we need to have at least an impact of 8 or above on average from at least every 2 to 3 minutes. That's the baseline. If you're not doing that, you're not even being remotely entertaining. To go to 9 and 10 is where the detail is. It's also harder to do, but it has much higher payoffs if you do it well. Professional speakers aim to have multiple impacts per minute. And so the preparation they would put into that is, rule of thumb, for every minute on stage, 27 hours of preparation. So that's why they're so good at what they do. Now, the average speaker, the average executive, the average employee doesn't need to go remotely even near that, which is why I use the 8 out of 10 impacts every 2 to 3 minutes is probably a safe bet. It's a good rule of thumb. So knowing that's the case, what do you need to do to create the impact? And therefore, what do you need to measure in order for that to happen? Now, some of it you can tell beforehand, like, oh, this fact's got to be really remarkable to this group. And some of it you have to do when you're in the room. So, if they're all paying attention, that's great. But if they're not paying attention, what percentage of people are not paying attention? And then what are the thresholds you need to have? For instance, if they're not paying attention for 10 seconds, maybe that's okay. But if they're not paying attention for 10 minutes, that's a problem. Or is 10% of the room paying attention or 80% of the room paying attention? And so we would measure all these things. And so when we knew that they weren't paying attention, we had a choice. You change the format, you move on, or you say something different. And so creating small changes that shifted variables allowed us to not go from A to Z in terms of presentation, which is what most people do. They write down what they're going to say, they say it in order, and then they hope someone understands what they've said by the end. And that's where the whole myth around say what you said, say it again and repeat what you just said comes into play. Because the reason people do that is people aren't paying attention and you have to say it 3 times. Now, I would argue if you need to say one thing 3 times, you've failed as a communicator. And so that's a total myth. It's okay for teaching and lectures, but not for speeches or speaking in general. Can you imagine if I said to you, hi, I'm Jon. Hi, I'm Jon. Hi, I'm Jon. Today I'm going to talk about speaking. Today I'm going to talk about speaking. Today I'm going to talk. That's annoying. That's not helpful. And so we've got to be mindful of that. So rather than having an A to Z, we have a decision tree where, if people are paying attention, you do this. If they're not paying attention, they're doing that. And then certain ratios will pick up and we'll flip the formats. And so it's a combination of a number of small things over time that create the variety. And when there's variety, there's interestingness. And so it's about knowing how to create that variety. And it gets a little bit complicated. It's hard. It's probably better to do visually than explain. So I hope people are not lost. But it then becomes just follow the bouncing ball. It actually becomes really, really easy. In fact, I'll give you an example. I got a migraine during one of our events, and someone on our team who wasn't part of the content development, wasn't part of the preparation team, and in fact didn't know what we were even talking about, decided to come onto the call. And I said to him, read the run sheet, look at the impact levels, look at the activities we're going to do. When you've got that under your belt, let me know. My migraine was so bad that I had to leave halfway through the presentation. He completed the presentation and it did not impact our net promoter score.
In terms of what you've seen be successful elements of an oration, just anecdotally, because I'm wondering, like, is the way you say it more important than the content? Like, content can be semi-interesting, but the delivery is amazing. Or does the content need to be just as interesting as the way it's delivered? Like, what are those elements, just anecdotally, and even if you've got data on that, but just because you've been in the game for so long, like, what are the elements that you would say is a receiver of an oration that really, like, wow, that was amazing?
In terms of priorities and ratios, I think 30% of your content is just facts. Content is not, let me go back half a step. Content is important. You need to have really good content, and it needs to be of importance maybe 30% of the time. You need those pieces of content. The problem is that content in and of itself is not actionable or exciting. So everyone knows you should eat well, do lots of exercise. Almost no one does it. So, content's important, but it's not necessarily the only reason people come in the room. The other factors are maybe in your delivery, the way you deliver it, because you can be monotone and boring. You can be interesting and lively. I guess that's obvious when you kind of point it out, but you need to spend time on it. The other 30% is really around your unique perspective on that content, and your wisdom and insight, if you want to call it that. Because if you want to transfer content, it's much easier to do it in an email or a web page. So as a communicator, we need to have a degree of insight and uniqueness that other people don't bring to the table. And that makes you unique as a presenter as well. So knowing that you need to sort of prioritize in those ratios, then you need to go, okay, have I over-prepared on the content and given either too much detail or too technical or too dominant? And if that's the case, you've got to offset with case studies or stories or narratives. There's a rule of thumb we have is make a point, tell a story, or tell a story, make a point. And that's one of the reasons professional speakers do that. It gives that idea some life, something they can relate to, something that people can understand and connect with. And there's scientific reasons for that, which we might go into in a second, but believe me, for the time being.
Well, why does it appear, and this is a subjective comment, that, when you look at the politicians, particularly politicians here in Australia, because they are generally doing the most oration in terms of what we all see as a community, there doesn't seem to be an emphasis on strong oration. Like, I don't see, or maybe it's how I value communication is different growing up in the US, but I would say that there doesn't seem to be anyone that has that ability to deeply connect. And I'm just wondering, in your view, is oration valued in Australia?
Great question.
Like, do we value it?
I think as a participant, as a receiver of the oration, I think when done well is a very effective way to communicate. But I think speakers in general underrate the impact it can have. And there was a great interview with Julia Gillard on her own podcast. Well, she was being interviewed, actually. It was the 10th anniversary of her misogyny speech. And it was a really good sort of reflection by her on why it had the impact at the time and what the expectations of the voting community was at the time and why it seemed to resonate at the time. And it's a really nice reflection on the importance of critical speeches like that. And it's worth going to dig up that podcast as well, dare I say.
Yeah. I think it's something that is important. And I think that, you and I have talked offline about Tall Poppy and maybe can you give our audience, because most of our audience is Australian, but there's a large percentage of our audience that's in the US and the UK and kind of scattered across the world. But could you give our audience a flavor on your opinion as to how Tall Poppy has influenced how we communicate here in Australia?
I think it's very much a colonial thing in general. One of the theories, and I can't remember which professor came up with this theory, was that during the convict era of Australia, there were many more convicts than guards. So when someone misbehaved back then, that convict was pulled out, treated extra nice, given special provision, well looked after, and a bit like the teacher's pet, like we have at school today, the other convicts grew to resent that person. And then when they were introduced back into the group, that they were picked on for that. And so I think sticking your neck out and being distinctive from a cultural point of view was impacted very much by those early colonial day convict backgrounds. So for the people who are not born in Australia, that's one of the theories why what we call the tall poppy syndrome exists. But I think it's still very much a foundation of the British stiff upper lip, be quite conservative, don't just disrupt the crowd type thing. I think there's some origins in there as well that kind of also become the overlay. When you think about the US, its very origin was based on the foundations of independence and free speech and the opportunity to do what you like as you like and not be under the oppression of the power of the time, which was the King of England. So that cultural overlay, I think, means that in the US, that desire to stand out, to be distinctive, to have your voice, to be recognized, and individualism in particular is part of that cultural narrative. And so when you have two almost extreme ends of perception come together, that's where the jarring potentially happens. So I think that from a cultural point of Australia and US, that's where the biggest impact or interface happens. And I think that's one of the reasons why Australians and New Zealanders, and South Africans and Canadians who have got a little bit more of a softer positioning in terms of the nature of their cultures get on so well, because they aren't sort of that sort of adversarial type position. And these are all theories, but I think they make a lot of sense when you reflect on them in that way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that having kind of grown up in the US and been now in Australia for a while, I really try to leverage both positions. I think in Australia, you create a lot of impact first through your kind of actions and how you operate, and then you amplify the message almost. Whereas in the US, you can come out of the gate screaming and then figure out how to actually build the system behind it. And I think there's learnings in both, and when to leverage either or, and how to be skillful in that. And I think that one of the benefits for me was I immediately started selling in Australia. So I had to learn how to tone down. And I remember when I got my first job in Australia, the recruiter told me, he's like, dude, you're going to have to tone down the yank. It's like, you're going to really have to, he said it to me, I'll never forget it, right? Like, and I was like, what do you mean? But let's move closer to you now, Jon. So you obviously help people communicate. Like, why do most of your clients come to you? Like, what are they trying to do?
A couple of common scenarios. And then there are a couple of that are rather interesting in that people just genuinely interested in becoming better and more effective as communicators. That does happen. But I think, the typical scenarios are someone's got an important presentation or meeting, usually a presentation to the board or a key announcement within their organization, and they want to make sure that they're hitting the mark and they're connecting, resonating with the people in the room.
Yeah.
That's the most common scenario. The next most common scenario is, okay, we want to make sure that we're internally efficient, and therefore our communication needs to be internally effective. And so the ability to communicate well, that resonates and has meaning for the people you're listening to, is a learned skill over and above command and control and ordering people around. And I think Australia in particular as a nation is moving from command and control as a leadership style into more consultative / coaching style. And that does require a lot more EQ, empathy, building rapport. Yeah. And so my work is actually increasing because of that. I think people are recognizing that We're human beings at the end of the day. And I think COVID amplified that. People aren't going to take people's crap anymore. They're going to pick a job that they like, they enjoy, that's rewarding, that nourishes them financially and personally. And I think leaders are recognizing that they need to adapt from that point of view as well.
And you and I touched on this before, businesses also have communication. I mean, some would call it branding. It's the perception that we all, outside of the organization or even within the organization kind of interpret. Have you bled into that area? Has that area kind of naturally kind of moved? Okay, well, here I'm a CEO and a C-suite person, and I'm looking to kind of become a better communicator. But part of how I'm viewed is I am viewed as the organization as well. And how does that then align with the messaging of the organization? It almost seems, particularly in the business context, that there might be an integration of the two,
About
right?
3 years ago, the Erdogan Trust Barometer picked up and still continues this line of thinking that CEOs, particularly in Australia, but just globally, need to make statements outside the traditional domains that they have in the past. They need to stand for and represent the people that they sell to, just as much as peddle the products and services they provide. And a classic example was, I saw an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, front page, lambasting Nike for doing the Colin Kaepernick Take a Knee campaign, and saying that this will be the end of Nike. They shouldn't be getting into politics. They shouldn't be, talking about things that are not relevant to them, And in that same year, Nike also did oversized clothing, for more shapely people, shall we say. And they did one other campaign. They honed in on their Nike Run, which is more about building the community as opposed to selling shoes. And there was another article by the same newspaper about Nike saying it was the most successful year in Nike's history because they did these things. So it was literally a 180 on the original article they'd written in January because they'd picked these lines.
Yeah.
And to your point, I think we're lacking leadership globally at all levels. I don't care if it's local or national or even global. And so the leader who stands up, who represents the people, believes in the people, understands the people, and becomes arguably part of the narrative of the people, is actually much more likely to build the trust, rapport, relationship, and engagement as a human being. And because of that, the brand that they have underneath them carries that brand with them. You can't separate them anymore. And I think that's a big part of it. It's funny because coming back to that Wall Street article, Trump was calling in the first article, calling Nike un-American. And I thought that was also rather interesting.
Yeah, I remember
the
that.
fact that a president is making a comment about a CEO of a shoe brand because of what they believe in is the level of conversation that leaders need to be engaged with.
Well, excellent conversation, Jon. Thank you so much for your time. One question, though, before we do go, is I'm interested in kind of becoming a better communicator. And other than obviously coming to you, Jon, which you should do if you are interested in becoming a better communicator, what are some of the steps I could take to just start to move towards that?
There's a handful of things that are absolutely critical. I think the first one is be very clear about what you need to say. And the way I summarize that is, can you summarize your message in a single compelling sentence? And the reason it needs to be single is it forces clarity. And if it's clear in your head, it can be clear in your audience's head. If it's not clear in your head, the audience hasn't got a chance. The clarity there is really important. Compelling because it needs to be meaningful to the person you're listening to. Now, our long-term memory, which is a hippocampus, and our amygdala, our emotional center, are literally physically connected in our brain. So when you're stimulating someone's emotional centers or creating meaning for them, you're literally stimulating their long-term memory. Whereas our short-term memory, the neocortex, the front of our brain, doesn't connect with those two parts of the brain, which means the only time short-term memory is going, or the logic part of your brain, connects to the long-term part of your brain is during sleep, which is a good argument for sleep, by the way. So, if you create a compelling statement, you're directly connecting with the long-term memory and not relying on their short-term memory. And then, so that's the first thing, single compelling sentence. The second thing is meet your audience where they're at. That's content complexity, that is language, that is time, that is energy level. Like, it's much easier to have a conversation with me in the morning than it is in the evening, just because of my energy level. So be cognizant of your audience and manage your message and your delivery in real time, ideally, to meet their needs. Because it's not about your content. If it's about your content, send it in an email. Connect with that person, create meaningful engagement, help them relate to it, then becomes the critical factor. So audience analysis then becomes a critical piece. And then, as much as you can, prepare. Practice and prepare. And look, if that's only 5 minutes, that's fine. But 5 minutes is better than making that up. Because you know what? If you do random, you're in trouble, because the law of averages says one day that will fall over. And also, hope is not a strategy. So, I think we need to be at least mindful and respectful for the people we're speaking to by being prepared in the first place.
Hope is not a strategy. I love that one, Jon. Anyways, that's going to wrap us up. Where can our audience learn more about you, Jon?
Brightstar.net.au is my website. But if you want to connect and engage, send me a LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to take LinkedIn. One request, though, because I do get a lot of requests because of TEDx Melbourne, is just put in the little request, I heard you on the Ultrahabits podcast, so I know the context of why we're connecting. Otherwise, I tend to ignore the ones that don't have any comments, because I tend to get someone who's either trying to sell to me or someone trying to pitch a TEDx talk, and I just haven't got the bandwidth to manage all those in LinkedIn.
Yeah, for sure. And particularly because you're a shy introvert, you don't have an appetite for unnecessary conversations.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm with you, mate. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jon. As always, man, It was great talking to you, man.
Great to chat again. See you again.